I'm going to kick off with the first question, if that's okay. So could you start by outlining the experience of discretionary payments in the schemes you work with and how this has impacted on scheme members, and perhaps why this should be a concern for policymakers? Who wants to?
I start?
Go ahead. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us. I'd like to begin to say that I'm really sad to be in this position. As a pensioner from American Express, I've always enjoyed working for the company, believed it to be a professional company, as do most of the retirees. However, the experience of discretionary increases at American Express scheme is in many ways a textbook example of how they've used the 1995 Pensions Act to produce a deeply unfair and unintended outcome for pensioners. Historically, American Express, particularly before the Act, pensioners received discretionary increases reasonably regularly. They were from 2003, that pattern with discretionary increases changed, and I believe actually Patricia is going to talk to that in a bit more detail. However, for American Express, there were only 3 discretionary increases in 22 years, in 2004, 2008, and they completely ceased after 2014. And this isn't just a random pattern of behaviour, it's a calculated pattern of behaviour on behalf of the company. Once American Express understood how the Act operated, and that the provisions allowed for companies where they didn't have discretionary increases written into their scheme rules, they began to restructure their pension governance, their review processes, and their trustee powers to ensure that they quite legally, and they use legally themselves to justify the fact they don't pay discretionary increases to us. So the legislation designed to protect weaker schemes has actually been used by highly profitable multinationals to avoid discretionary increases completely and indefinitely. The result's been a slow erosion of spending power for pensioners. Our pensions in the pre-97 scheme have eroded by virtually 40% since the discretionary increases ceased. And that's not just a statistic. We have case studies that people aren't eating properly, they can't heat their homes properly, they're having to move, they can't find places to rent. And as a result, you know, it is a real life story. It's impacting people badly.
If we could hear from other panel members as well, if you could.
Yeah, okay. I believe that in the current framework, the pension scheme bill is going to turbocharge this, because unless legally the pension trustees are given back the power to distribute surplus to pensioners, the company will keep the entire lot. We have no confidence that they will distribute it to our members.
Can I ask other panel members to contribute?
Yes. I absolutely endorse what Caroline has said. I'll just maybe read a quick excerpt from a letter that I got from one of our pensioners just the other day. It was unsolicited. He's a pensioner of Hewlett Packard Enterprise. He was formerly with Digital Equipment. His first pension was drawn in 2008, and it was £954. His pension in October of 2025 is £997. He said his purchasing power has dwindled. His pension should be $1,615. Over the years of steadily decreasing value, he's given up his car. He and his wife no longer have mobile phones. They can rarely afford a meal out. They've nearly used up all of their savings. They're about to have their 50th wedding anniversary, and they don't think they can afford to do anything with that. Meanwhile, the costs of utilities are skyrocketing, and they're desperately trying to keep up their home of 46 years. That is not unusual in our experience. I'm fortunate or unfortunate to live in the community where I was once the personnel manager, We hired probably 10,000 people in South Ayrshire during the time that I was there. And the impact of the pension lack of discretionary increases is absolutely visible. You can see it all around you. Unfortunately for us, the rest of the impact is really diluted. We have lobbied MPs and probably have contacted 40% of the population of MPs. Our population is really dispersed. So I would agree with Caroline that without a change in the law, Hewlett Packard is not going to change. They do not recognize this as a problem. They do nothing to collect the data to find out how the lack of discretionary increases affects people, which I think is quite shocking. They do ask the Pension Association for hardship stories. And I will admit that last year I said to them, I'm not giving you any more hardship stories. Nothing happened with the last slot. So they're still pressuring us, but they make no efforts to really study the effect of their decisions.
Okay, and I'll bring in Jonathan and then Jack. Can I ask if you can perhaps comment on why there appears to be a shift from paying discretionary increases to not paying them?
Okay. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. For 4 years running, BP has rejected affordable discretionary increases, despite a record 4 billion pension fund surplus. The Chief Financial Officer is on record as being unable to envisage circumstances when surplus could be shared with pensioners. So, for us, for the BP Pensioner Group, the track record suggests that the company is determined to resist sharing surplus with pensioners directly by rejecting requests and indirectly through its majority on the trustee board. We believe that the surplus provisions of the pension schemes bill must be strengthened so that employers can't hang on to the surplus and pensioners can get a fair share.
Thank you. Jack?
Thanks. I'm afraid I'm not sure kind of why there's been a change, but I think the experience of our members suggests there has been quite a stark change. I think where there are no kind of pre-97 increases in scheme rules, it certainly has become a kind of a reasonable expectation that there would be discretionary increases, and I think that was very often communicated by employers and by trustees as we will make best endeavours to pay increases when it's affordable, and that's often quite clearly communicated. And obviously you also had the kind of experience of years of kind of putting that into practice. I think often schemes were funded on that basis, that they would be trying to make discretionary increases. So kind of, I don't know whether it's it's partly a practice thing that when schemes, or so many schemes for so long were underfunded, something changed and that kind of expectation dwindled, and now we're in a position where schemes are much more healthily funded in general. Something has changed. I don't know if it's to do with levels of member representation, whether this is a scheme moving to sole trustee kind of models where you've not got that member voice on the committee. So yeah, I'm afraid it's not a very helpful answer, but apart from confirming that it certainly has been a stark change that we've seen.
Can I just ask, so you say that the reference to discretionary payments was clearly communicated to members. Was that in writing?
I'm afraid I'm not sure. This is reporting members' experience from maybe 20 or 30 years ago. I can certainly do some digging and see if I can find good examples for you. I'm sure colleagues or panellists will have similar examples.
Yeah. I think that would be very helpful if you could.
Ours were definitely in writing. I have a box full of literature that says, particularly the literature when the company changed hands, that says specifically your benefits will not change. And they did. And I think we've already distributed that. And it shows the effect in practice of the 1995 Act. It took a bit of time to bed into the system, but I can also prove that the funding was there. And once the Act took effect, the funding was removed.
The DWP and the TPR plan further work to understand why schemes were not making discretionary pre-97 payments. What questions do you think they should be asking?
Could you just repeat the question again, Joanna?
So the DWP
Yeah.
and the pensions regulator plan further work to understand why schemes were not making discretionary pre-97 payments. What questions do you think they should be asking?
Well, I'll try and control my temper, because when David Carson, my colleague, was here 2 years ago, there were very specific questions that we gave to the select committee about what we wanted to ask, and I was very disappointed with the quality of the survey that was done last year, which asked about, within the last 3 years, how many of your companies have given increases. I mean, that little booklet that's gone around, we're not talking about 3 years, we're talking about almost 30 years that people have not had increases. So those are the kinds of questions. I don't think Bill 255 reflects an in-depth understanding of what happens on the ground.
Sorry, I think Jonathan wanted to.
Yes, I think in our case, and I think this is right across the vast number of pension schemes, the composition of the boards of the trustees has changed. These schemes have been closed, people have moved on, new people have come in, and they're now seen as a burden to the companies, whereas 20 years ago they were a critical part of the employment offer. Mm-hmm. Indeed, in the case of BP, we were promised that our pensions would go up with inflation, and that hasn't happened. Mm-hmm. They're also seen as an opportunity to extract surplus, and this is, I think, one of the weaknesses in the bill. Surplus extraction provisions are not strong enough to ensure that this doesn't continue. I mean, we can't say for sure, but many of these schemes must be thinking, many of the companies must be thinking, ooh, these surpluses have gone up. They've doubled in the last 2 years. Can we get hold of them? Mm-hmm. Now, of course, Mr. Bell would like them to get hold of them. We think that's a good idea too, provided that the pensioners also get a share. And I think the question to be asked is, what are these trustees going to do to make sure that pensioners get a fair share of the surplus as it is distributed?
Thank you.
Can I briefly answer that? I actually think they should be, to Patricia's point, looking back much further and looking at the patterns of discretionary payments and when they ceased, because we've highlighted it here, but I think they need to understand that. They also need to look at changes in scheme governance, because that's what happened to us. Basically, the powers of the trustees were completely removed. This has been a deliberate strategy that they've employed, so pensioners have no voice in this. And ultimately, unless the pension schemes bill is amended to give trustees legal power, the companies are just going to ride roughshod over this. Very much to your point, Jonathan, they're just going to take the surplus, and that's going to be the end of it, and pensioners will never see a penny.
Thank you.
I think I would agree with both. I think it would be really important to look at whether there have been specific rule changes that have changed how the process worked for agreeing discretionary increases. What board structures look like, again, kind of whether you've got a sole trustee model, whether you've got 50-50 member representatives, how you are appointing those member representatives, what's the process that you go through there. I think, and it would be useful to, maybe this is for a future question, but I think it would be useful to look and compare kind of how this works in other countries where you've got conditional indexation rather than discretionary indexation, and quite often you've got kind of a voting structure on this, which ensures that you've got a proper balance of power between member and employee representatives. I think that's probably particularly important when you're looking at surplus release and ensuring that you can actually, that both sides have a veto effectively, and that seems to, in other jurisdictions, work really well as a way of forcing some kind of agreement and compromise on this.
Thank you. I'm afraid we do need to move on. We have a lot of questions to get through. I'm going to hand over to Damien Egan.
Thank you, Chair. We touched on some of these already, because I was going to ask how you would describe the respective roles of employers and trustees in the decision making, just to make that clear for the panel and how that has changed over time. I was also going to ask about the impact, but that's really clear from the chart that you've provided. The follow-up question would be, successive governments have ruled out making indexation requirements retrospective. So what do you think would be the most effective outcome now, given that, for scheme members?
Right. To address the power balance between the company and trustees, it's 100 to nothing. This is about as far from a democratic process that has the voice of the pensioner being heard and being spoken as you could possibly get. I would file this relationship somewhere between abusive and incestuous. We just recently had 4 spots come up on the member-nominated trustees. Supposedly 18 people went forward. We still don't know the result, but I know 2 people who went forward that had qualified on all of the training modules with distinction. They didn't even get an interview. So, and I also conducted my own survey. I have a survey of 500 members that says that 90% have none or a little bit of confidence in the relationship between the trustee and the company. And the rest of the pattern is the same. For the people in the alliance, it goes even higher. So 90% are not at all confident that there's an appropriate balance of power within the company and the trustee. It's a rigged game. The voice of the pensioner doesn't get there at all. So I would say there's no confidence. Surplus. Members say, I paid into that scheme for years. In fact, I believed the mantra and I put in even more with AVCs. And what am I getting for that investment now? And the company is going to get surplus. The powers represented in Bill 255 are absolutely not at all different from the powers that our company and trustees have now. There's not a single bit of change. Now, our scheme is still recovering from the days of Liz Truss. So our trustees told us last month that maybe in 4 years there might be a surplus. But 50% of my own peer group have already passed on. So in 4 years it'll be a lot more.
But there is something that can be done, and it doesn't require legislation, because the Secretary of State already has the power to increase the percentage of independent and member-nominated trustees from 1/3, which is today, to half. And that would begin to make a difference. That's one of the proposals we put in the paper that we've submitted to you as evidence. We also think it's important that the chair of the trustees is seen to be independent of the company, and to be sure that it would make a difference as well. So trustees are under tremendous pressure. This whole question of what happens to the surplus of discretionary increases, this is fundamental, but it's new because most of the schemes didn't have surpluses to distribute. The regulator, who'll be speaking to you later, is aware of the potential for conflicts of interest. It's serious. These are fundamental issues. They affect pensions and they affect the future of the companies. And just relying on some sort of trade-off between the two sides doesn't seem to me the right way to proceed.
Can I just say as well, I thoroughly endorse what has been said. American Express has tightened its controls totally, changing the rules on the trustees. Our trustees have no power, and they've written a letter which I submitted as part of the written evidence that shows they will not argue on our behalf. And I also agree with you. We would like to see that at least 50% of the trustees are member nominated, and they're actually voted for by the members, not just chosen by the company, because the company are choosing people that aren't going to challenge them.
Okay. Steve.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions, but I just wanted, strange enough, I think we know the answer to this one, but how effective would you say the mechanisms are for making complaints about not making additional payments?
There's been no effect. We have tried almost everything, I think, that is humanly possible. We have written to the board. We have written to the chief. I'm not talking about once. We have written to them multiple times. Written to the chief executive, the chairman of the board, all of the board members. We have even lobbied some members of the U.S. government. We have had physical demonstrations. We have lobbied MPs. We have tried everything to get them to engage on this issue. They keep saying the same thing, which is we are doing what is required by law, and this is where I would disagree with my colleagues on the panel. There is only one way out of this, and that is a change in the statutory legislation. That is the only thing that will cause a change with Hewlett Packard and all of the companies there. There are 11 major multinational companies that are only going to yield, and they've said it to us in writing, when the law changes, we will.
Thank you. And are you aware, any members of the panel aware of any successful complaints in these systems one way or another, or is it fairly barren?
I'm not aware of any successful complaints. We, again, have tried several communication channels. We've written to the trustees, we've written to the American Express board, we've contacted the CEO, we've contacted the UK country manager, and really had no meaningful responses. In fact, we get responses from a UK DB Communications. We don't even know if they have the right or the authority to be replying on behalf of these people. We've made formal complaints, we've had no meaningful response. But on top of that, I want to highlight that we've had inaccurate information, because the power changed from the trustees making decisions on discretionary increases to the company, and still 12, 13 years later they were telling pensioners when they crystallised their pension that it was the trustees making those decisions. Therefore, people have made decisions about their financial future based on inaccurate information.
You're effectively flogging a dead horse with any form of complaints.
Yes,
There's nothing.
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Just to add, in our case, we have had responses to our complaints. Actually, lawyers have written those responses, and they're very detailed, and so we understand where the company is coming from. We don't agree, and we are about to take our case to the pension ombudsman. So we will see the extent to which promises made as part of employment offers need to be honoured.
Just to unearth that a little bit more, pension ombudsman, what has your collective experience of the power of the pension ombudsman on this situation been?
One of our members went, I think there might have been two, I only know of one. It was totally unsuccessful. And when we considered doing it again, he said it was the worst 3 years of his life, and he wouldn't recommend that anybody try it. In addition to what my colleague has just said about letters from lawyers, we have received letters from lawyers to basically telling us not to bother the company with this at all, and threatening between the lines legal action.
Thank you. Abhorrent. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I bring in Peter, just wanted to jump back. So successive governments have rolled out making indexation requirements retrospective. What change, I'll ask Jack this one, what change do you think would be most effective in improving outcomes for scheme members?
I think I would support Jonathan's answer to that, which is increased levels of member representation, and that is, I think that is something that could easily be tied to surplus release as well, as a kind of almost a carrot stick kind of approach for employers, or a kind of a quid pro quo to allowing that to be kind of discussed. And it's something that we've suggested as a kind of as a starting point. We've put proposals that it shouldn't be allowed to release any surplus if you've got a sole trustee. But I think it's worth looking at whether it would be helpful to make that stronger and say you should actually have that 50% member representation there. And as I said earlier, I think we've also got good examples from other countries where it's not just about the level of representation. It's about having a dual voting structure, which means that I think that the example I had in mind actually was Canada when I said that, and the scheme I was thinking of there, which has been very successful in paying out this conditional indexation. Over the last couple of years, they've paid 100% of inflationary increases, even when it was up at 10%. And they've got a structure where I think they've got a 5 and 5 trustee member and employer trustees, and any decision has to be supported by a majority, but also at least two of the employer or employee trustees. And that seems to give a balance of power that that allows those decisions to be reached in a way that gets good outcomes for both sides.
If I add to that, we would also like to see an obligation on trustees to consider the erosion of pensions in the previous period when surplus is allocated. So this is not just being nice. They are required to consider the loss of value. In the case of BP, our pensioners on average have lost £2,000 of income, and most of our pensioners were industrial workers in refineries, on the rigs, in the chemical plants and so on. So very substantial loss of income, not just for 1 year, but for the rest of their lives, and it compounds for the rest of their lives. So it is important, not just for BP pensioners, but really probably for the 9 billion other pensioners out there, that the loss of value which has happened, and particularly over the last 3 years, and this is awful for the pre-97 pension, is addressed.
I would really push back on the government and say, why? Why not? I don't buy the story that about retrospective. We were not going to do this retrospectively. The funding wasn't there in the first place. The funding was there. These companies paid discretionary increases for years until the law kicked in, and then they stopped. The law gave them the legal opportunity to stop the payment. The law is what changed. It's nothing to do with the retrospective funding. The money was there. And so I don't accept it.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. I think you've just touched on my first question, but you argue for changes in legislation to strengthen the rights of members to share the surplus, which I totally understand and get that. A number of us on this committee also served on the Pension Scheme Bill Committee, so we've seen lots of arguments around this. However, the government's reluctant to do that, to prescribe how those surpluses are used. I just wondered, what alternative measures do you think could be effective if it isn't in legislation to achieve that?
Can I say I don't think there's any, because we've demonstrated quite clearly that these companies, these rich companies, profitable companies, are using the law already, and unless you give legislation within the pension scheme bill to ensure that pensioners get a fair share of the surplus distribution, it will not happen. Our pensioners, our trustees have been quite clear about this. It's not their role, and they're not going to challenge the company.
Why do you suspect the government isn't doing that then? Why isn't the government doing that in the legislation? What would be the arguments for not doing that, in your view?
I'm at a loss, frankly.
I'm not going to second guess the government on this one. I mean, first of all, I have to backtrack to what surplus? Our scheme is extremely conservatively funded and set up. It's very conservatively managed. It's not set up to do more than wash its face. It's not set up to make a huge surplus. We haven't had one since the days of Liz Truss. We're not going to have a surplus for the next 4 years. So surplus, what surplus?
We do believe we will have a small surplus. How the company choose to use that will be down to them, I guess, unless the trustees can have a say in this.
It is an important point that in the past, many of these companies benefited by not contributing for years and years. So in the 90s and in the last 20 years, there have been long periods of pension holidays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in a way, there's been an extraction of surplus, and it was mentioned that many of these schemes are contributory, or in BP's case, people have invested their personal money in additional contributions. They expected to have pensions rising with inflation. That's what our promise was. It hasn't happened.
We touched on the trustees in terms of there's a need, I guess, for education and cultural adjustment in the trustees to understand, obviously, that their role in this, in terms of the members' interests, but also the sustainability of the funds. I just wonder what changes you think should happen on the trustees board to ensure that members are better heard or their interests are better represented.
I think the problem is with pre-97 pensioners versus other pensioners. The role of the trustee, as I understand it, and I believe backed up by a legal opinion from a major multinational, is to look out for all pensioners, not just the pre-97 ones. So they cannot actively lobby on doing anything special to help the pre-97 pensioners. They basically are locked into colluding with the law as it stands, which is no discretionary indexation for pre-97.
And in terms of, so what ideas would you have around improving the governance then, around this, in terms of what changes should happen, that isn't in the bill perhaps, that should be in the bill, to strengthen the governance in this space? Maybe Jack, maybe you've got an opinion on this.
Few things that come to mind. One is kind of in response to like Pat's scheme being incredibly conservatively funded and invested. That is kind of, I think, what is behind the surplus release measures in the bill, isn't it? And I think the idea that you could get to a position where, I mean, it depends very much on like the maturity of the scheme, kind of what kind of investment strategy would be appropriate. But if you can encourage employers that they can get some of the surplus if they invest in a slightly less conservative way, or if they allow an investment strategy that does that, and share some of that benefit with the members, it feels like kind of in theory you can see that's a really good kind of target to be aiming for. Just in terms of your question about kind of how you can actually make sure that the members' voice is heard on the trustee board. Just one thing from my experience as a trustee of the TUC scheme, we do an AGM every year, and that is tends to be very well attended by retired members. It gives us a really good opportunity to hear from them directly. And this particular issue, it's not an issue for our scheme because we have indexation of pre-97 benefits, but I am often quite surprised by the questions that are asked by the pensioner members. And I realise that this is kind of a once a year chance to hear directly from them, and I think it is valuable. So I don't know whether the schemes that people here are.
We've had them in the past. They've become so acrimonious. We can't have them anymore. We can't even have them remotely. I have to go back to the intent of the bill, which is surplus extraction. To me, is trying to use pension schemes as economic development stimulus. It's not the same thing at all. The intent of a pension scheme is to provide for the financial security of pensioners. It's not there as a vehicle to stimulate the economy. I think those two purposes are at odds with one another. One is oriented towards conservative investments, conservative management. The other one is trying to be more aggressive, take more risk. As a pensioner, I'm much more in favor of the conservative approach.
Can I also add, I mean, there's a danger here that you're actually incentivising companies not to give discretionary increases, because the less increases they give, the more they're going, the better their chance of getting to extraction. So it's actually going to turbocharge some of these multinationals on a strategy they're just set on to make the situation even worse and put people into greater penury.
To answer your question, I think it really comes down to giving the trustees power to deal with the companies and to be genuinely independent. And that is the problem. What is fiduciary duty, when defined, essentially means making sure that the fund can pay the pensions that it's legally obligated to pay. But that's not the same as acting in the best interests of members.
Yes.
So, going a little bit off topic, but it's connected. So, increasing the power of the trustees in this space, because in the bill, and this isn't part of this session, we've got the mandation point about mandating investments, essentially the powers with the Secretary of State that could be used. Now, that arguably kind of dilutes the influence of trustees and the fiduciary duty that they have. This is another example of that here, in terms of the conflict between, as I think your colleagues mentioned, the tension between, surplus extraction for investment reasons versus actually this is just here to sustain our members' benefits. So I guess what I'm asking is, in the bill, do you believe that this is damaging the power of trustees and the ability to actually stand up for their members?
I don't think so, because you have to differentiate between defined contribution and defined benefit. I think this is largely about defined contribution. Defined benefit schemes are largely in the point of de-risking, investing in equities, cutting the investment in equities, investing in gilts, index-linked bonds, and so on. And that's very different. I mean, they're closed to members. They don't need the growth anymore. Defined contribution, it's a different story. The government mandate, the mandate, I think it's pretty marginal for defined benefit schemes.
And for a number of years, a lot of these schemes obviously were in huge deficits, right? And then they swung into surpluses when interest rates fluctuated. And now a lot of them are kind of, my understanding that there is quite a significant backlog in kind of buyouts at the minute in terms of the industry ability, the insurance industry's ability to basically take those forward. And I guess the next set of questions I've got relates to buyouts in terms of whether you believe there's an opportunity to enhance members' benefits by going down that route, and how likely you see that happening.
Enhance members' benefits through buyouts? I doubt it at all. In fact, it would work in the opposite way. It would wind up that the pre-97 issue would never get picked up or resolved. It would be over.
I think that any powers that are there for surplus extraction should also be applied in wind-up. So if you have something in the bill that says a fixed percentage must be given to pensioners on extraction, you should have the same in wind-up. Otherwise, you're going to bias the companies to hang on for wind-up. In fact, this is one of the weaknesses of the bill, if you ask me. I think it may encourage a lot of companies to hold on for wind-up and do the very reverse from what the government would like.
I think the main way in which buyout limits how much you could potentially give additional discretionary benefits or benefit augmentations of any kind is that it's really expensive. And so that most of any surplus on like a technical provisions basis or any kind of other funding basis goes to the cost of insuring that scheme. So that really limits, even if you had all the kind of strongest powers in the world to kind of decide how that surplus got spent, a lot of it just goes as soon as you enter into that kind of transaction with the insurer. I think it would be really useful to have something to give the trustee stronger powers to make sure that any surplus that does remain after that is used for the benefit of members. I think it probably couldn't be too prescriptive. Just kind of thinking about how trustees would decide what's the best way of augmenting benefits. It may well be that you look at the insurer and how they're pricing and just think it's not very good value to say we will give as much indexation as we can where there is no mandatory indexation. You might think if you're a trustee, actually it's better just to give a one-off increase now that's a flat benefit, or to give in some other way, just because of the way that insurance pricing works. You should have a requirement to make sure that surplus is used in the best interest of members, but probably some discretion of the trustees to decide actually what's the best way within the kind of insurance world to do that.
Without the binding power to do that, I agree with you, but without the binding authority to do that, and in our case, the trustees simply don't have that authority.
No,
so
nor do ours.
To add to that the point that Chet was making, it seems to me that the employer has a choice, which is he can share some surplus with pensioners, or he can share surplus with insurance companies, and they will look at that fundamental choice. So you wind up the fund, and the insurance companies get a big chunk of the surplus, or you extract surplus, and if you've got good trustees, you have to give some of it away to the pensioners.
So I guess in trying to bring all this together, what would you like to see government doing then in the bill to enhance the benefits for your members, or not doing?
I'd like the government to put in a fixed percentage should go to pensioners. I don't think that's that realistic. That's why instead we're saying address the issues of lost value over the years. when the decisions are made.
But what's your solution to that? Introduce that fixed percentage.
Whichever decision, whether it's wind up or extraction. I think that if you have a different regime for wind up as opposed to extraction, you're going to get undesirable outcomes. You bias your decision making.
We'd like to see the trustees definitely having binding authority, because we're just powerless in this situation without that. They need to have the authority to distribute part of the surplus to pensioners. If you want to specify how much, that would be brilliant, but to your point, that may not.
One idea which I've come across is that actually where discretionary increases have been rejected in the past, they should now be approved as a priority during extraction.
I would like to see the government say something on the matter clearly, and especially it could come down to ethical procurement. HPE in the last 5 years, 750 million in direct government contracts. That's not including the contracts with defence, which are not public information. So the Welsh government has already taken a stand on this issue. I would like to see the government say, this is not okay to treat your former workers, the people who built your companies, that created the value of the companies that you bought. The government has remained silent on this issue, and I'm very disappointed that it's the pensioners who have to drag it, like the postmasters and postmistresses had to drag it in front of the country to say, I mean, we're not talking about £1,000. Some of the people in this scheme have lost £100,000 and face the end of their life with significantly reduced resources. And I'd like to see the government say something, not have a bill which actually opens the door to pensioners having even less by allowing these companies to extract surplus. I think it's appalling.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes before the next panel. Are there any final comments that you would like to make before we conclude this panel?
This morning we heard that inflation in September reached 3.8%, which is actually lower than expected. But that 3.8% is actually quite a lot higher than the statutory maximum of 2.5%, which used to be 5% and got reduced 20 years ago to 2.5%. And I think that should be addressed. It's four years now that inflation has exceeded the statutory maximum of 2.5%. We don't know what's going to happen to inflation in future, and I think this fundamental problem is going to remain unless the statutory maximum is also addressed.
I would like to see the TPR, as I say, go back much further in their research, understand what is happening, to understand that there's a clear strategy of multinationals, wealthy multinationals who are highly profitable, using the 1995 Pensions Act to avoid paying discretionary increases forever, and ensure that the pension schemes bill does have legal binding power for trustees to be able to distribute any surplus to pensioners as well.
If the government were to say something that this is not appropriate, I would not be surprised if HPE changed their practice, because it would cost less than 1% of their net operating profit and less than 1 year of the compensation for their chief executive. And it might just get their attention in what still is one of their bigger markets, that the government does not look kindly on the abuse of pensioners.
I'm really glad Jonathan brought up capped indexation, because I think that is it's a really important thing that trustees should be discussing now when they're talking about increases every year, even where it's there is some indexation. Just lastly, it's all about trust, and I think even though most people today are going to be saving into pension schemes that are very different to the DB schemes that people on this panel are on, I think it's still it clearly undermines trust in the system when
Absolutely.
people see there was what looked a lot like a promise there that has been broken. And I think we still, even though we've got a very different system, we still rely a lot on people having trust in the system and quite a kind of paternal kind of approach to it. So anything like this that undermines that trust is damaging for the system as a whole, not just the kind of people that are in this position.
Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. We'll just give a couple of minutes for the panels to change over.